After the end of World War II, the world was split into two, East and West. This marked the beginning of an era known as the Cold War. The war was nothing but a mask for the race between America, Russia, and China to retrieve the mass fortune known as the philosopher's legacy. The early stages of this race explored the military origins, unyielding patriotism, and the start of the tragic downfall of legendary soldier, the Boss, along with the upbringing of her apprentice, Jack. Now it is time to dive deep into a new chapter of this era, one that explores events leading up to the pivotal Operation Snake Eater. Welcome to Part 3 of Metal Gear Lore. It is 1962. By this time, Jack had been mentored since the young age of 15 by legendary soldier and spiritual mother, the Boss, until 9 years later on June 12, 1959, when the Boss abandoned Jack to fulfill a top-secret mission for the government. In the next 3 years, the Boss would serve her country with unparalleled patriotism, only to have its government unleash the full extent of their resentment for their own failures upon her after the once proud nation had lost the space race to the Soviet Union. It was also during this time that two NSA codebreakers, Adam and Eva, defected to the Soviet Union, a pivotal event for the years to come. To make matters worse, unbeknownst to America, under Soviet Premier Khrushchev's order, rocket scientist Nikolai Stepanovich Sokolov began work on the treading nuclear behemoth known as the Shagohod. The Russian scientist made significant progress during 1962, but soon began to experience a crisis of conscience as he began to realize the ramifications that such an invention could have upon the world. Before completing the project, Sokolov decided to defect from the Soviet Union with his wife and child. By September of 1962, David O., who had gained the codename Major Zero after joining the CIA, learned of Sokolov's intentions and soon established contact with him. In the days to come between late September and early October of the same year, Major Zero conducted an operation to aid in the defection of Sokolov and his family to the United States. His wife and child were successfully evacuated to the West, and Sokolov followed separately soon after. He journeyed over 1,000 kilometers, or approximately 600 miles, in a period of 2 weeks towards West Berlin. The operation was successful, resulting in Sokolov passing over from the east side to the west side of the Berlin Wall, but the long journey had left him exhausted and in need of recovery, resulting in his hospitalization. Despite the long journey, all seemed well for the man, until a week later. On October 14, 1962, an American surveillance craft discovered Soviet missiles strategically stationed in Cuba. This discovery led to the non-fictional event within the Cold War known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States demanded that the Soviet Union dismantle and remove the missiles, announcing shortly after that the nation would enforce a naval blockade that would prevent Soviet missiles from reaching Cuba. The Soviet Union did not back down, however, instead placing their armed forces on secondary alert. Rising tensions between the two superpowers risked nothing short of a full-scale nuclear war. Finally, 14 days later, on October 28th of the same year, after frantic, long, and arduous negotiations between President John F. Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev, the two nations came to an agreement. The official story was that the Soviet Union agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba under the condition that the United States made a public announcement declaring and agreeing to never invade Cuba. The US also secretly agreed to remove missiles strategically placed in Turkey and aimed at Moscow. This official story is the true story engraved in our history books, but in the Metal Gear lore, this official story was nothing more than a cover-up. The missiles that America agreed to remove from Turkey had no strategic value in this fictional world and were removed to serve as masks for the Soviet Union's true condition, that America returned Sokolov, having no idea what Sokolov was helping the Soviet Union create, and with every passing second risking a full-scale nuclear war, America had no choice but to comply. After Sokolov recovered from exhaustion, Major Zero had no choice but to hand over Sokolov to Soviet agents. Sokolov was returned to his research facility soon after to continue work on the Shagohod. 1962 wasn't just a tragic year for renowned rocket scientist Sokolov, but also for legendary soldier, the boss. Despite having sacrificed everything for her country, blame and resentment for the nation's failure to win the space race was stacked on the boss's shoulders by the very government and agencies she aided. Even after waking from a 6-month coma on October of 1961, resentment continued to loom. It was during this time that the boss's use of the anti-Moscow faction of the Soviet Union's philosophers to plant her sleeper agent would come to bite her back. At some point, America's philosophers came to realize that the sleeper agent's defection was a result of the Soviet philosophers bribing him after finding out about the anti-Moscow faction and the sleeper agent the boss had planted through them. Worst of all, the anti-Moscow faction, which had allied with America, didn't tip America off about any of this. This meant that either the pro-Moscow faction intervened, or the anti-Moscow faction had somehow been turned. Regardless of what had happened, America blamed the boss for using the untrustworthy anti-Moscow faction's philosopher network to plant her agent, which led to America being the only party oblivious to the agent's defection until it was too late, an embarrassing fact that further fueled the nation's resentment towards the boss. The Soviet branch of the philosophers also shared America's resentment after she had managed to use their own branch of the philosophers against them to plant her agent. Her punishment would be set in motion in 1962 when she was sent on a special mission in Soviet territory, Selino Yark, to eliminate the very sleeper agent whose defection had cost America the space race, and the very agent that the CIA and NASA continued to trust despite the boss's warnings. When she returned to Russia to fulfill her mission, she would find her lover, the father of her child, and her comrade in arms, the Sorrow, waiting for her. It was then that she learned the man who had turned her sleeper agent was the Sorrow, who was unaware of the boss's involvement. The Soviet philosophers began plotting their revenge against her soon after they discovered her plan involving the sleeper agent by purposely sending her lover to pull it apart. Knowing that the Sorrow would have second thoughts about working against her, he was never given knowledge of her involvement. Then, months later in 1962, the Joy and the Sorrow would be sent on this special mission to fight to the death. And thus America's resentment and the Soviets' revenge were unleashed. To ensure the two would go through with their mission, the Soviet philosophers threatened their child, Adamska. The two lovers contemplated their options, but in the end, the boss had no choice but to shoot the Sorrow, who offered no resistance. After completing her mission, the boss would continue to act as an agent in Soviet territory. Shortly after these tragic events, the boss was contacted by longtime acquaintance and former SAS comrade, Major Zero, having learned the reason why the Soviet Union sacrificed so much to retrieve Sokolov, which was to continue work on a nuclear-armed tank known as the Shagohod. Major Zero contacted the boss to form a new CIA unit in hopes to attempt a second rescue. Together, the two formed a new CIA subdivision known as the Fox Unit. In the months to come, between the end of 1962 and summer of 1964, Major Zero recruited SIGINT and paramedic to their unit after recognizing their talent and potential, and Jack followed sometime after. Soon the crew began making preparations for Major Zero's second attempt at the rescue of rocket scientist Nikolai Stepanovich Sokolov, an operation codenamed the Virtuous Mission. Furthermore, the boss, who still remained in contact with the US despite acting as an agent in Soviet territory, was ordered to take part in this operation, but for a different purpose: to recover the mass fortune known as the Philosopher's Legacy. In order to do so, the boss had to find ways to gain the trust of the current owner of the legacy, Colonel of Russian Military Intelligence Agency GRU, Yevgeny Borisovich Volgin, or Colonel Volgin, who inherited the legacy from his father, Boris Volgin, the man responsible for laundering the mass pool of money during World War II, until he stole it during the war's fallout. Around a month prior to the August 24th commencement of the Virtuous Mission, after utilizing the Philosopher's Spy network, the boss finally managed to get Colonel Volgan's attention, who contacted her with a suggestion of defection, just as planned. The boss accepted, and after gaining Volgan's trust, obtained information pertaining to a weapon that could turn the tide of the Cold War. The boss learned that this weapon was nearing completion and being field-tested in Selino-Yark, and that Sokolov had been moved from his OKB-754 research facility to an abandoned facility in Razvet, a convenience that made Sokolov's rescue much more feasible. This information was then relayed to the CIA and Major Zero. Knowing that this was the best chance to retrieve Sokolov, and knowing that this weapon of mass destruction was nearing completion, the CIA was left with no choice but to greenlight the Virtuous Mission, ordering the Fox unit to send an operative on August 24th to retrieve Sokolov. August 24th was fast approaching, but prior to this date, between August 17th and August 23rd, a female Chinese spy under the alias Tatiana managed to infiltrate Selino-Yark and meet up with Sokolov, convincing him that she works for Premier Khrushchev and that her job was to supply the Shagohod data upon its completion. Then, on August 24th, 1964, 5:30 a.m., Jack performed the world's first halo jump and successfully parachuted his way down to Selino-Yark. After a successful landing, Jack contacted Major Zero to establish codenames. Jack was given the codename Naked Snake, while Major Zero decided to call himself Major Tom. During this conversation, Snake also learned that there was one more individual on his support team, his mentor and spiritual mother, the boss. It had been 5 years, 72 days, and 18 hours since the boss abandoned him to fulfill her top-secret missions for the government. Despite his many questions, Snake continued his mission, glad to hear her voice once again. Within a few hours, Snake succeeded in infiltrating Selino-Yark and made contact with Sokolov. It was then that Snake learned of the involvement of an anti-Khrushchev faction planning to overthrow the Soviet premier, and that one of its members, Colonel Volgan of GRU, was preparing to capture Sokolov and the Shagohod to aid the faction's cause. In short, two factions, the pro-Khrushchev faction with its KGB army and the anti-Khrushchev faction with its GRU army, were competing for power. The former was losing power, especially after the recent assassination of Khrushchev's largest ally, President John F. Kennedy. The pro-Khrushchev faction soon learned that the rival anti-Khrushchev faction was planning to seize Sokolov and his new weapons, which is why Sokolov was moved from his research facility to an abandoned factory. The anti-Khrushchev faction decided to take advantage of its rival's fading power and strip it of dominance by planning an operation to steal the Shagohod and its lead scientist. Snake, previously unaware of this, simply reassured the guilt-ridden and frightened Sokolov that he would be taken to safety. On their way out, complications arose as they were ambushed by KGB operatives guarding Sokolov. Knowing full well the stakes of Sokolov falling on the hands of the anti-Khrushchev faction, the KGB army was given strict orders to kill Sokolov should an attempt at his abduction be made. But in the nick of time, GRU Major Ocelot made his appearance, killing all KGB operatives single-handedly after mistaking Snake for the boss. Realizing his mistake, Ocelot summoned his unit, the Ocelot Unit, to surround Snake, but they proved to be no match for him as he disabled each one of them using the CQC combat style that he and his mentor developed. After rendering the last of the Ocelots unconscious, Snake and Sokolov proceeded to the extraction point. But then, someone unexpected appeared before them. They were greeted by none other than the boss herself, who nonchalantly stated that she was defecting to the anti-Khrushchev faction of the Soviet Union, joining GRU Colonel Volgan. Alongside her was the Cobra unit, who swiftly captured Sokolov. The boss explained that Sokolov, along with the Davy Crockett miniature nuclear shells she brought with her, would serve as gifts for her new hosts. Snake's attempt to stop her proved to be futile as he was bested in close-quarters combat. The one-sided battle concluded, with Snake being thrown off the bridge into the strongly flowing body of water, but the boss knew full well that her apprentice would survive and that they would soon meet again in battle. Snake was washed up on land and survived, but gravely injured. With the help of paramedic, he tended to his wounds and rested. It was during this time that Snake saw a corpse that, unbeknownst to him, belongs to the boss's lover, the Sorrow. Snake rested on the same location that the joy and the sorrow met for the last time. After a brief look at the corpse, Snake soon witnessed a squadron of choppers flying away, which transported Colonel Volgan, the boss, the Cobra unit, Ocelot, Sokolov, and Tatiana, along with the stolen Shagohod, away from Selino Yark and into a fortress in which the Shagohod would reach its completion, a fortress known as Groznygrad. Inside his chopper, Colonel Volgan met Tatiana, who was assumed to be Sokolov's woman, and then he does something that no one anticipated. Out of the blue, he used one of the David Crockett nuclear shells to blow up Sokolov's OKB-754 research facility. Volgan knew he would get away with it, knowing full well that intelligence would blame the boss. Snake witnessed the explosion before being extracted via the Fulton recovery system, and the Virtuous Mission ended in failure. Following the mission's failure, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev contacted the President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, inquiring about the recent attack on Soviet soil. Khrushchev saw it as no coincidence that an American aircraft was detected on Soviet airspace at around the same time of the nuclear explosion. This was the same aircraft that housed Major Zero, paramedic, and other crew members who were part of Snake's support team, which had nothing to do with the attack, but information about the aircraft was something that the president could not disclose, as he would have to risk telling Khrushchev that an American agent infiltrated Soviet territory, which would worsen matters. The president denied America's involvement, stating that the nuclear explosion was orchestrated by GRU Colonel Volgan, along with the recently defected American soldier, the boss. Khrushchev demanded that America prove their innocence by eliminating both individuals or risk full-scale nuclear war. The CIA was left with no choice but to send Major Zero's Fox unit once again, assigning Naked Snake, the boss's former apprentice, as the agent to carry out her assassination. Along the way, Snake was also to terminate other involved parties such as the Cobra unit and Colonel Volgan, destroy the Shagohod, and rescue Sokolov. Should the mission result in failure, the Fox unit would be disbanded, and both Major Zero and Naked Snake would be executed as traitors of their country. But most importantly, failure to carry out this mission would risk World War III. To aid the Fox unit, the KGB provided one of their communication satellites to allow Snake to stay in touch with the support team. Furthermore, they were given access to Soviet KGB agents Adam and Eva, the codenames of the two NSA codebreakers who defected to the pro-Khrushchev faction of the Soviet Union on September of 1960. Agent Adam, who had infiltrated the ranks of GRU, was to supply Snake with means of extraction after the successful accomplishment of the mission, and thus, on August 30th, 1964, at 11:30 p.m., Naked Snake was once again deployed to Selino Yark. After a successful landing, Snake established contact with Major Zero, who codenamed their most important mission yet, Operation Snake Eater.
Darkness and silence through the night. What a thrill. I'm searching and I'll melt into you. What a fear in my heart, but you're so supreme.